Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm joined by the Minister of Finance, Grant Robertson, who will shortly run through a package of actions that the government's going to take to fight inflation and ensure that the government's books return to surplus as soon as possible. A lot's changed in the global outlook since the budget. In the months since then, global economic growth has slowed as demand from China has softened and global milk prices have fallen. At the same time, world crude oil prices have jumped, adding to inflationary pressures here at home, resulting in the Reserve Bank indicating inflation could stay stickier for longer. While the fundamentals remain sound, and it's clear the economic cycle that we're in will at some point come to an end, what's important now is that the government maintains our balanced and responsible fiscal approach to set our economy up for success. As a result, we're acting now to find additional savings on top of the $4 billion in savings that were identified in May's budget. While those actions in May were characterised by the Reserve Bank as more friend than foe when it comes to inflation, the recent forecasts are keeping pressure on the cost of living. So we're taking action now to take the heat out of the system and to support Kiwi households. The government's provided families and households with cost of living relief through a range of policies such as the winter energy payment, removing $5 prescription charges, making early childhood education cheaper, and making public transport either free or half price for young people. That's on one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, we're making sure that the state does all that it can to fight inflation and to help keep interest rates down. We can do that by balancing the books and setting New Zealand well up for when the economy does bounce back. Today we're setting out further measures to do that with a program of inflation easing savings and efficiencies that the government's requiring the public sector to make. This will trim a further $4 billion from government spending and have the books back into surplus as soon as possible. These changes are sensible and timely, and while significant, I want to underscore the fact that they deliberately do not affect frontline public services. In fact, we've carved out frontline public services from any reductions in spending. This is a responsible course of action to take. All political parties across the Parliament will have seen the warning signs from the global economy and forecasts that have been worsening over the last 3 months. It's why I've been saying for some time now that this should not be a big spending election campaign. Uncosted, untargeted tax cuts for millionaires like those promised by the opposition are simply not affordable. Likewise, broad sweeping statements about slashing the number of public servants and abolishing entire government departments is destabilising, and it also isn't upfront with New Zealanders. In making these decisions, the government is striking a careful balance. We're supporting New Zealanders in the here and now and investing in strong public services and a resilient infrastructure network, providing cost of living relief while carefully managing our resources to ensure the long-term sustainability of our economy. I'll now hand over to Grant before we open up for questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. At the budget in May, we launched a fiscal sustainability and effectiveness program. This included identifying $4 billion of savings across the forecast period that we could shift to deliver higher priorities and stronger public services. As the necessary and significant support required to get New Zealand through the COVID pandemic has been withdrawn, we know that we need to return to a more sustainable fiscal position. This position is shaped by the fiscal goals that we have set of keeping debt under 30% of GDP and achieving an Obergale surplus in the forecast period. In doing this, government expenditure as a percentage of GDP is forecast to go down to 31.5%, close to the long-run average. Achieving these goals was always going to be a challenge. Even at Budget 2023, a surplus was not forecast to be possible in the next 2 years. A period of high inflation, while adding to government revenue, has also increased the costs of delivering the high-quality public services that New Zealand deserves. At the same time, deteriorating global economic conditions and the hangover of COVID impacts is putting pressure on government revenues. Since the forecast for the budget were finalised by the Treasury in April, we have seen further evidence of a global economic slowdown. Tax revenue in the published government accounts for the 11 months to the end of May was $2.2 billion below where it was forecast to be. Since then, the Chinese economy in particular has shown signs of strain, and overall global trade is expected to slow in the coming year. This, of course, affects New Zealand. Global dairy prices have continued to slide, and Fonterra has dropped its farmgate milk price forecast twice in a short period of time. All the while, the war in Ukraine and geopolitical tension between the US and China has continued. It is worth noting that in those same government accounts to the end of May, the government's spending is in line with forecast. It is the drop in revenue that is the issue. The deterioration of the economic picture has meant that we need to move swiftly to ensure that our fiscal goals are met and that we return to the sustainable economic position we need in a timely manner. The Fiscal Sustainability and Effectiveness Program will ensure that we do this in a balanced and responsible way. Some parts of this program are ongoing and somewhat technical. There will be ongoing funding reviews for agencies to understand the drivers of baseline expenditure and look for efficiencies. We've also changed the processes around what is called out-of-cycle expenditure, i.e. calls for spending outside of the normal budget cycle, where there will now be a higher bar for agreement. This type of work will keep a stronger ongoing control on expenditure. Today, I'm announcing a further set of actions that Cabinet has agreed to as part of the program. Firstly, immediate savings. I asked all ministers to look again at their agencies' work programs to identify savings that could be made immediately. This is focused on programs that do not require all of the funding that had been allocated, or where programs had not commenced, or could be phased, sequenced, or delayed. This exercise has netted more than $1 billion operating and $450 million capital savings across the 4-year forecast period. Secondly, limits on expenditure on consultants and contractors. The second component is a focus on the reduction of this expenditure. We are directing public agencies to cut back on spending on consultants and contractors to pre-COVID levels. This will equate to about an 18% reduction in spending on these services. The Public Service Commission's main contractor and consultant measure is operating expenditure as a proportion of workforce spend. After inheriting a spend of 13.4% in 2017-18, we reduced that to 10.4% in 2021, before it spiked, largely due to COVID-19 related expenditure, in 2021-22 at 14.6%. The government is committed to getting contractor and consultant spending to below 11% of public workforce spending, saving approximately $165 million per year. The third element is baseline savings. Thirdly, and driven in part by the reduction on spending on consultants and contractors. We have asked agencies to identify 1 or 2% of permanent savings that they can make in their budgets from Budget 2024 onwards. We have set clear parameters for this exercise. Frontline services and support payments are to be protected and excluded from the savings. Larger agencies are expected to find greater savings. This means that the exercise will apply to around 19% of the government's total spend, and this exercise will save approximately $1.4 billion over the 4-year forecast period. We recognise that this will be challenging for some agencies, but just as households and businesses need to cut their cloth to meet the circumstances they face, so does the government. I have asked ministers and chief executives to consult with the PSA and other relevant unions in this process. We often find that those who work in programs have the best idea of where efficiencies can be made. Looking ahead to future budgets, we are focused on having the resources we need to provide the critical public services that New Zealanders rely on, while balancing that against meeting our fiscal goals. In this context, we have reduced our budget allowances for budgets 25 and 26 by $250 million and $500 million respectively to be $3.25 billion and $3 billion. It is our judgment that as inflation reduces and economic growth increases, these levels of new spending will meet the cost pressures that exist and leave a small amount of room for new commitments. It will be tight, but it is important that we get the balance right. I want to be very clear that the level of savings that we have identified here go as far as we can do in good conscience to meet the balance and protect frontline services. Going further would start to undermine the investments in public services that have been made and those that are needed to support New Zealanders. Those who would propose deeper cuts to pay for tax cuts skewed towards higher earners will be placing in jeopardy the public services that New Zealanders rely upon. To make that clear, the National Party would need around $11 billion across the forecast period to pay for their tax cuts proposals above and beyond these savings. New Zealand was able to get through the pandemic with our economy and society in relatively good shape because we invested in our people and supported our businesses. We will keep doing that while striking the balance required to ensure that as a country as a whole, we have the strongest financial position possible to build on for future generations. Prime Minister.
All right, we'll open up for questions, and we'll take questions around this announcement first, and then the Minister of Finance can leave us, and we'll deal with other issues of the day.
You found $4 billion in savings. Does that show how much fat is in the system?
No, what that shows is that we are committed to meeting our fiscal rules, that we're committed to protecting frontline services, but that we have set agencies a very clear task that within that 19% of expenditure, that they need to find either 1 or 2% of savings. In the immediate savings exercise that we're doing now, we've gone back to ministers and we've said, are there funds that you haven't used all of or you haven't got going yet? And we've put that together. So what that means is there's a balance across a number of different elements. This will be a challenge for people, but it's the right thing to do to get our books back into surplus.
It's a bit cynical though, the week that the House rises, before you head out on an election campaign, you've magically found some savings in the government's books.
Well, no, what we do is we deal with the circumstances that are in front of us. And bear in mind, we began this savings process at the budget. We announced that there would be an ongoing program of work. And so we've continued that program of work. We've also had to, I'll just finish this point, Jenna. We've also had to face up to the fact that the forecasts that the Treasury gave us, that we put the budget together on the basis of, already, when we got the first set of accounts after that, were just over $2 billion short in terms of revenue. The world is getting harder on top of that. It's the responsible thing to do to now say, we've got fiscal rules, I've committed myself, I've got a job to do to meet those, this is how we're going to do it.
So why, for instance, is the DHB baseline funding in here, $71 million? The DHBs have been defunct for a year, over a year now. Why have you magically found $71 million from them?
So in that particular instance, that money of course got transferred through to Te Whatu Ora when it was created. We've been working with them on what exactly they need to be able to deliver the services and programs that they deliver.
The $71 million.
And this $71 million is because they have other ways of achieving the goals that money was put aside for.
So the health system is fine and it doesn't need that 71.
All frontline services in the health system are protected.
Your remark in the press release about the surplus within the forecast period, obviously the forecast period changes depending on what year you're in. So what is it still forecast a surplus in 2026? That was the last one.
Yeah. So obviously that gets updated at PREFU. PREFU does not add a new year into the forecast period. That would happen at HIEFU. This is really thrilling for those who aren't as focused on these matters as Thomas and I are. And so that, for the purposes of what we're talking about, it's the existing forecast period. I do want to stress, we're doing this before the Treasury has finalised their forecasts, but it's pretty clear to me, looking at what happened with the May accounts and the deterioration in the global economy since then, that the responsible path is for us to act.
Back to Jenna's point, this is you conceding that you've overspent on consultants and contractors though, isn't it?
No, it's not. In fact, as I said when I spoke earlier, we had actually began the path of bringing expenditure on consultants and contractors down until we hit the COVID period. What this does tell us is that we have to work very hard now as that expenditure goes out of the government's books to make sure that we bring that contractor expenditure down.
You let Omicron rip through this country 18 months ago. Why are we still spending on COVID consultants?
We're not. What we're saying is that it's reducing and that our policies here, our commitment here is to reduce that further, and obviously I completely reject the first part of your question.
How long has it been going down there?
So it's been going down, it went down, it went back up again, and it's beginning to track down from there. But look, the point here, Jenna, is that we're acknowledging that we do need to get agencies to focus on bringing that expenditure down. Our track record going into COVID was that we were bringing it down.
Minister, do you
can I
regret
just-
having such a large budget in this year? You say that you started that process of slimming things down, but the finances are still expansionary in the current year, so that's not entirely correct, is it?
Well, it is, because what we did was base the budget on the forecast that Treasury gave us, and that did see us moving into surplus in the period of time that we said then, in May. So we cut our cloth on the basis of the forecast we were given. It is clear to me, on the basis of the government accounts to the end of May, that the revenue side of those forecasts is short, over $2 billion short. Nobody watching the world would think that things are getting better since those government accounts were forecast. So we deal with what's in front of us. We have a set of fiscal rules. My job is to make sure that we meet those.
Sure, but at the budget, you committed to increasing the government's borrowing program by, I think it was 20 billion, just off the top of my head, more than what the economists thought. So it was actually a massive budget. Do you regret that?
No, I don't, because among other things in that budget, we were dealing with the impacts of Cyclone Gabriel and the Auckland anniversary weekend floods. We did need to spend to make sure we dealt with that. We also targeted the cost of living measures that the Prime Minister put forward. But I just want to reiterate, we did that on the basis of a set of forecasts. It's quite clear to me that the revenue side of those forecasts is not going to be met.
But the shortfall is about 2 billion, right? And you expanded the debt issuance program by about 20 billion more than everyone expected. So you still increased the spending by, a large amount.
I don't think it correlates quite that way. The debt program obviously did have to expand in order to be able to meet what we do. Governments always issue bonds. That's how we fund ourselves in terms of debt. Every government does that. Yes, it did have to go up a little bit to meet some of those costs, but as I say, a lot of that was unavoidable around the cyclone.
When that allegation was made about the...
just a lot of New Zealanders, I imagine, when they hear the word savings, might think that the overall amount that the government spending is reducing. But it's actually the case, right, that you are trying to crimp the increase, because in nominal terms, I mean, the budget's still going to go up, and you're trying to essentially reduce that a bit in order to help the revenue pressures. Is that right? Can you put that into...
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in any given year, what the government needs to spend is what we need to spend, and that will increase. But clearly, what we're saying here is, in order to achieve those fiscal rules, keep debt under 30% of GDP and get a surplus in the forecast period, my judgment is we need to make these savings. These are things that we've committed to or that were built into the baseline of a budget of an agency. We need to bring that down a bit, nudge inflation down at the same time, because any additional spending above and beyond, like the tax cuts that are being proposed, potentially runs the risk of increasing inflation. So we have to calibrate all of those things together. So they are savings on what was proposed.
If you want to fight inflation, the time to do that was last budget, or even the budget before that. You're cutting spending from budgets in the future where hopefully inflation won't be such a problem. The window to fight inflation from a government budget perspective has passed, do you not think?
Well, no, because the budget we put together in Budget 2023 was in fact targeted to help bring inflation down, and that's precisely what Treasury's forecast said it would do.
What is the impact on what is the likely impact on the public service headcount?
Yeah, look, that's to be decided, and each agency now works its way through how to meet, and you've got a very specific table of the amounts of funding and savings that we're looking for. Clearly the consultant and contractor piece will be part of that. There's also a lot of vacancies in the public service at the moment, and we're certainly asking agencies to work out whether or not they need to fill those. And as I mentioned before, we've asked chief executives to work with the PSA and other relevant unions to find efficiencies. My experience, the experience of many New Zealanders, will be that when you actually ask the people who work on specific projects and programs, they more often than not are the ones who can identify to you where the efficiencies are. So there isn't a specific headcount target here, there is a dollar target, and chief executives and ministers will now work on that.
Is it fair to say that thousands of public servants are about to lose their jobs?
No, it's not fair to say that at all.
You talk about the one of the things you're considering is the path to surplus. Obviously, you haven't seen the Treasury forecasts for the pre-fu. What does your gut tell you? What's your gut tell you on how the revenue is going to stack up compared to those surplus goals? Because I mean, it could look pretty brutal come a couple of weeks.
Yeah, look, $2.2 billion short in the May accounts. As I've said, anyone looking at the world will be able to tell you that things have not been getting better. So we'll see where that lands. It's my judgment that what we're doing here today will enable us to meet those fiscal rules. Obviously, whether that judgment's correct or not, we find out at pre-fu.
When that $20 billion allegation was made by Winston Peters et al., the other thing that was released at that time was that you had been driving public service bosses to lower savings by 2%. That was correct. Nicola Willis had that correct, didn't she?
No, Winston Peters said 10%.
Nicola Willis said 2.
So be it.
So she was correct.
Well, you can see today that it's between 1 and 2%. We have been continuing to... What's that?
Is the public service leaking against you?
I don't think so. The public service is doing its job. Individuals might choose at different times to do things, but that's not particularly relevant to me.
Is that not concerning?
Well, it's just not relevant to the exercise we're doing. We've given the public service a job to do here, and I know they'll get on and do it.
Just back on inflation, a council trade union report highlighted rising company profits as relevant for over half of the pressures of inflation. Are companies making too much money? Is that a factor?
Well, I think companies have got a duty to explain themselves to consumers and to make sure that they're only doing what they need to do in order to be able to meet their costs, pay their staff, do the things they need to do to deliver to their shareholders. So, clearly we will keep an eye on that, and all New Zealanders will. We can't do much to actually stop that per se. What I would say, though, is that inflation has been a global issue. So this is something that has happened right around the world. It's not specific to New Zealand, and it clearly has been driven in large part by, supply chain issues through COVID, the absence of inward immigration. Those sorts of issues are the big factors. But where companies are doing that, they will have to explain themselves to their consumers.
You increased your operating allowances at each budget this term. How do we know that the announcement you're making today, you'll stick to it if you win another term of government?
Well, this is the judgment that we've got today around what is needed to meet the cost pressures we've got, and as I said in my opening statement, a small number of new commitments. The Budget 25 and Budget 26 will be delivered in a much lower inflation environment in the budgets that we've recently delivered, and we believe it will be sufficient.
Absent a massive shock, COVID or something, other horrible thing happening, how committed are you to seeing that surplus through and adjusting your operating allowances to make sure that you hit it?
I'm committed to the fiscal rules that we've got. We've always tried to strike a balance here between making sure we're careful with the finances for the sake of future generations, but also delivering the public services that New Zealanders need. And I'll always take a responsible and balanced approach. That's why this is not an environment where we should be seeing people promise big unfunded tax cuts that have cost more than $10 billion across this period. So I'm committed to that balanced approach.
How have you calculated that?
Savings list, 236 million, of that is from the Climate Emergency Response Fund. It should be ring-fenced for climate spending. That's how it normally is treated, but it's being sent back to the general coffers. Is that appropriate?
You'll recall, Mark, that in Budget 2023 we topped up the Climate Emergency Response Fund from general taxation in order to be able to continue to deliver. So in this particular instance, I think it's appropriate that that comes back to the centre, but we will continue to use that money in the future in the Climate Emergency Response Fund for emissions reduction and adaptation.
There wasn't any indication at the time that money was a temporary loan that you'd have to cut policies later in order to pay it back to the general coffers. So.
Yeah. Look, we're still investing significant amounts of resources in emissions reductions through the Climate Emergency Response Fund. But in this particular instance, given that we did top the fund up, we think it's appropriate that this comes back to the centre.
The fund is now $1 billion lower than where you thought it would be at Haiafu. You took 800 million off the budget and now 200 million off today. Maybe you're spending money on climate, but you're reducing the amount of money you're planning to spend on it.
Well, we've used what we had in the ETS revenues and we topped that up, and now a small amount of it is returning to the centre. Where that now goes in the future will be the subject of pre-fu.
When you say that the National Party needs $11 billion on top of this to fund their tax cuts, what tax cuts are you including in that? How have you done that?
Bracket creep and the interest deductibility.
Prime Minister, in your introduction remarks, you said that this would help fight inflation. But like Dan says, that many of these actions don't come online for a few years. So for Kiwis watching this now, wanting to see what help they're going to get in the near future or the short term What's your answer?
I've said one of the best things that we can do as a government is to make sure that, that we're bringing inflation back down again, and that we are focused on supporting New Zealanders with targeted cost of living measures. The targeted cost of living measures I'm talking about were announced in the budget, and then of course, as we go in the election campaign, the Labour Party's setting out a 10-step plan to support New Zealanders through the cost of living, and we've got a few more steps to set out yet.
How much of this $4 billion are you going to splash about in the election campaign?
None of it. It's all going back to the centre.
You found $4 billion in savings, but just go back a few months, you were telling nurses and teachers that there simply wasn't enough money or more money to find to improve their offers. Was that a disingenuous comment to make now that they see $4 billion of savings?
No, not at all. In fact, if you look at what we did for the teachers, we went back to the education budget and found savings in order to be able to deliver those pay rises. I'm very proud actually of the work we've done over the last few years to lift the pay of nurses, teachers, other public servants. But what we face now is a situation where the Treasury's forecasts do not appear as if they're going to be able to be met. I've got a job to do to get the balance right. You still get strong public services through this. You still get lifts in budget allowances. But, we have to be balanced. We have to be practical here. And we can't afford to be promising things that will cost billions of dollars more.
How was money
Senior
trust
doctors, you've also got junior doctors going into bargaining. And on top of the senior doctors, you've also got junior doctors going into bargaining next month as well. Are you confident that there is actually enough money to meet, the demands of these doctors who, obviously, I'm sure you will agree, have been carrying the load big time over the last few years and are now quite far behind in terms of pay? Junior doctors, for example, year by year level with nurses are now earning less than nurses.
Yeah, look, we obviously are in a negotiation there, and I'm not going to do the negotiation here on the stage. We certainly respect the work that junior doctors do, and Te Whatu Ora are leading those negotiations, and they obviously understand the financial parameters that they've got, and as ever, I'm optimistic that we will come to a conclusion.
And restraints put on those negotiations?
Well, as I say, I'm optimistic we'll come to a conclusion.
Minister, has this episode affected your trust in Treasury and its forecast? Because they have provided you with numbers to create a budget that were off by $10, $14 billion.
Look, forecasting is more of an art than a science at the best of times, and I think everybody who's been doing forecasting through the COVID period has struggled with it. I have to deal with what's put in front of me. I don't get to create a budget based on anyone else's forecasts. I only get to create a budget based on Treasury's forecasts. They haven't finalised those yet for pre-fu, but clearly what we saw in the May accounts has given me pause for thought, and then the deterioration of the global economy has added to that. So it's just not something I get a choice over.
The $100 million here returned from a couple of shovel-ready projects. Were they not so shovel-ready after all?
Oh, look, the vast bulk of the 230 odd projects that were funded through the infrastructure reference group are fine. They've been developed, they've been delivered. There were one or two where some of the commitments from other partners didn't materialise, or where when further work was done it was realised that they weren't able to be delivered. But there would be a couple of projects out of 230 odd.
It's not getting a conference centre anymore.
No, it's not.
Just back on inflation, one of the the government's previously spoken about the social licences that applies to banks in these sort of scenarios. Should that also apply for private companies?
Well, that's the point I was making before. Private companies need to answer to their consumers about whether they're treating them fairly. But this is in the context of a global inflation spike, where the hangover from COVID, the supply chain constraints, the lack of people coming into work has put a lot of pressure on businesses as well. But absolutely, businesses are answerable to their customers.
Any other questions for the Minister of Finance, and then we can move on to others?
Maybe it's a follow-up to
Go on
Luke's
then, Gina, and then Thomas.
Quick follow-up to Luke's from earlier. How bad are your books going to look come September?
Well, that is something that will be put out there in September. What I've done today is, by my best judgment, put us in a position to meet our fiscal rules. That is, to have a surplus in the forecast period and have debt under 30% of GDP. The underlying fundamentals of the New Zealand economy remain strong. Clearly, all countries in the world are now needing to deal with the global environment deteriorating. New Zealand will continue to have a resilient economy. I'm just completing my job here to make sure we get into surplus.
That in a slightly different way, how worried are you about how bad the books are going to look?
As I say, we can see from the May accounts where the deterioration in revenue has come from. This is my best judgment today about how I can make sure that we meet our fiscal goals.
Shouldn't the government be sort of counter-cyclical to the rest of the economy? So if everybody's tightening their belts, the government should be spending more?
Well, clearly within the 81% of government expenditure that's not affected by what we're talking about today, there are a number of counter-cyclical measures. In fact, they're built in to the budget in terms of things like benefits and so on, but also the work we're doing in building hospitals, building schools and so on. And the capital side of our budget remains robust. Housing is another area where I do agree with you that we can be counter-cyclical, and we'll continue to do that. This is about 19% of expenditure where we think we can make some savings while not affecting those frontline services.
And what did New Zealanders miss out on from not having this $4 billion spent?
Well, look, you can read the things that are in the immediate savings area. New Zealanders will still have good, strong public services delivered by this government, but there are some things where we believe either they don't need the money that's currently being put in there, or there are savings and efficiencies that can be made. But New Zealanders can rely on us to deliver public services. If you had to cut further than this, then you'd be in trouble.
Was there a climate assessment added to this, the cabinet paper that made this decision, and if so, what did it say?
Oh, look, I'd have to go back, Thomas, and have a look at that. Clearly, we bear in mind our climate goals, and we continue to invest to make sure that we do reduce emissions and that we do get on with adaptation. That's always part of our thinking.
It's quite an unfortunate announcement to be making for you as you stand here as, you know, what could be the last post-cab for this government, you know, after years of standing up announcing new spending commitments to be announcing these sorts of cuts?
This is a balanced approach, and that's what I've tried to do over the last 6 years as Minister of Finance, deal with pandemics and economic challenges while making sure we deliver good quality public services. And we're doing that, and we'll continue to do that. But these are the savings that I believe we can make and achieve that balance.
You didn't deny that this might be your last post-cab.
Well, I was about to do that, but
for this government, it will be my last post-cab. I look forward to joining you, Jenna, straight after the election.
All right, thank you to the Minister of Finance. And we now move on to other issues of the day.
So
If there are any. Oh, I can go. No.
Winston Peters said it's a sign of desperation that you would announce you wouldn't work with him after the election. What's your reaction?
I said when I took on the job as Prime Minister that closer to the election I would set out the parties whose values and ideas were compatible with my own and with those of the Labour Party. That's exactly what I've done. I've done exactly what I said I was going to do when I took on this job.
Should Christopher Luxon be up front about it?
I think all New Zealanders are entitled to know, you know, what parties' values are, what their ideas are, what they stand for, who they can work with and who they can't work with, and which policy ideas they're willing to entertain and which ones they're not. That's what I'm trying to do.
His press conference was interrupted by the same guy that followed you around the Otara markets a week or so back. Are you worried about how much disruption there is going to be in the campaign from the Freedom's candidates?
It's clear that Brian Tamaki and his mob are very determined to disrupt the election campaign. Ultimately, that's anti-democratic. They're denying all New Zealanders the right to hear from all political parties. Christopher Luxon is absolutely entitled to hold a press conference. He's entitled to share his views with the New Zealand public, and the New Zealand public are entitled to hear those views as well. So same with me, same with every other political party leader. I'm not going to go around disrupting other party leaders or other parties' press conferences. I think a party that thought it had any shot of getting into Parliament wouldn't be doing that. This is just Brian Tamaki and his team trying to make a lot of noise and disrupt everybody else.
How do you deal with that? Does it turn into a security? When does it tip over into a security issue?
I'm not going to stop campaigning because Brian Tamaki and his crew are trying to disrupt the election campaign. I'm still going to get out there and I'm still going to campaign. Ultimately, the main thing they're doing is actually robbing all New Zealanders of their opportunity to interact with politicians and to hear what politicians of all different, colours and stripes are proposing. I don't think that's good for democracy. But ultimately, those are really questions for Brian Tamaki and his people.
That's legitimate protest from your point of view.
What was that?
That's legitimate sort of political discourse from your point of view.
Well, we have a country where free speech is valued and cherished and encouraged, but I don't think people should use that deliberately to drown out the voices of others.
One more question on that. Are you worried about election security? Are you doing anything differently this time in terms of election security? It feels much more niggly out there and like a different environment than we've had before.
Obviously, this will be the first campaign that I'm entering as a leader of a major political party, but I intend to get out there and press the flesh and meet people and share the views and the values of the Labour Party. set out the positive plan that I think we've got for the future. People can engage with that, they can not engage with that, that's up to them. That's the nature of election campaigns.
Yeah, you've always got DPS on you though, right? Are you looking as a wider party at whether your other candidates need more security?
As will the Leader of the Opposition, if not now, then certainly within the next few days. The Parliamentary Service Commission has been working across the Parliament to identify whether there's additional support that can be supplied, particularly to incumbent members of Parliament who I think are more likely to be targeted by these kind of protesters than people who aren't currently members of Parliament. So there is additional support that can be drawn on if MPs feel that they are going into a situation that's more risky.
Like cops or parliamentary security guards?
There'll be coordination between the Parliamentary Service and the New Zealand Police as well to make sure that everybody's democratic rights are upheld.
Is campaigning going to look different though than maybe previous elections, given the climate and what we have seen over the past 3 or so years?
I think we just have to feel our way through that. I mean, look, you all saw the video footage of me at the markets in Otara a couple of weekends ago. I decided to persist with that visit for a period of time. It then became clear that that was just counterproductive. No one was actually really getting the opportunity to interact with me because Brian Tamaki and his team were so intent on disrupting that. So there wasn't a lot of point in continuing with that. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to continue to try. But obviously we'll adapt as we go along.
Are there going to be some scenarios or some events that you're not going to do this and maybe big walkabouts in big crowded places? Is that the sort of thing that you will continue to do, or will it be pulling back a little bit in terms of...
I think where there is a credible security threat, then I would not proceed with that, because not just for my own safety, but actually for the safety of everybody around me. And I think all political leaders should apply that lens to their campaigning activities.
What's the security advice that you've been given about the threat level compared to, say, 2020 or 2017?
I think if you look around the world, we're seeing more heightened activity at the fringes of the political debate, and I don't think New Zealand will be immune from that. Having said that, I'm still determined to get out there and campaign and to be accessible to the public, because I think that's what election campaigns should be about.
You need to be more mindful of...
If Winston Peters hadn't have already ruled you out a good year or so ago, would you have made that announcement that you made yesterday?
I made the announcement based on Labour's values and our ideas and who else's ideas are compatible with that. I don't think that New Zealand First's approach is compatible with our own. Unlike what they're saying, I don't think that that's a personal attack. I think that's actually just a principled statement of our position.
Do you need to be more mindful of your language then, given the kind of incendiary campaign that we're heading into? Do you need to be more mindful of your language? The opposition's called you, accused you of stoking fear and division.
I would encourage anybody who is looking at the opposition's response to my statements yesterday, I would encourage them to go and have a look at what the opposition have been saying about me since the day that I took on the job as Prime Minister. Much of it has been very personal, most of it has been negative, and that is the nature of the campaign that they have been running. I believe that the statements that I made yesterday were statements of principle and values. I don't believe I personally attacked anybody.
Just on those statements of principles and values, particularly relating to queer and trans people, is it Labour's record on that to just ignore the hate speech reforms you took to the election? That was too hard. And you also let Posey Parker into the country, which was created a complete shit show.
Well, if I take those two things, because that's not a technical term, but if I take those two things in the order in which you raised them, the hate speech legislation is a complex area because it does interact with areas around free speech, and I think free speech is important. One of the reasons that we have asked the Law Commission to take over that piece of work is that we do want to try and find a basis on which parties in Parliament can come together and grapple with the very real issues that are being raised. And in terms of issues around Posey Parker, we believe in free speech. Posey Parker is entitled to share her views. Other people are just as entitled to strongly state that they disagree with that. Now, where people are expressing their views in an inflammatory way and other people are expressing their views back in an inflammatory way, that's the nature of democratic protest. I think the difference was what we saw yesterday, or was it today, I can't remember, I'm not sure exactly when it happened, with the Leader of the Opposition, was that he was actually just trying to conduct a peaceful media stand-up press conference. There was no justification for disrupting that whatsoever, and I don't think he should have been subjected to that. And I actually think it's not in keeping with the democratic tradition that we have in New Zealand.
What is your record on delivering for queer and trans people? What have you done this term?
I think if you look at the stuff that we've done around conversion therapy, if you look at the work that we're doing around HIV and AIDS, I think we have got a proud track record there, including the changes that we've made to the Births, Deaths and Marriages Act. So I think we've got a proud record there. Is there more to be done? Yes, of course there is more to be done.
How does just a quick one on Gloria Vale. Can you give us an update on the multi-agency response by the government? What is happening down there right now?
Well, it's a tricky area because obviously there are some court proceedings ongoing, and I don't want to interfere in that. But where the courts have made decisions, we've got a multi-agency team which is being supervised by a group of ministers who are making sure that the findings of the court are actually being implemented by Gloria Vale.
So are children being exploited for child labour down there now?
Well, the various ministries who are working with Gloria Vale will be working to ensure that the rulings of the court are actually implemented. It is not acceptable for children to be exploited in the way that the court has found that they have been, and so we need to make sure that the court's rulings are actually being enforced.
So a year later from that court's ruling, why can't you stand up there and tell us that children are not being exploited for child labour?
Like I said, the agencies that we've got going in there, I haven't got the most recent update from them, but the agencies that we've got working on that issue have been making sure that the court's rulings are being implemented.
Can you tell me that children are not being exploited right now?
Well, I personally haven't gone to check, but certainly the agencies responsible are tasked with that job.
Prime Minister, how does Posey Parker's return next month sort of play out, or how do you see that playing out in this sort of combustible environment, and what will your strategy be?
As I've indicated, people have a right to free speech, and that includes Posey Parker as well. I don't agree with her views. I think she conveys them in a way that's deliberately inflammatory, and I don't think that's positive. I don't think that adds to the debate in any way that's useful or constructive. And I fully support the people who will oppose, who have indicated that they would oppose her views and express a contrary view.
Prime Minister, what's your reaction to the internal police report on the management of people on EM bail, and do you think it warrants a further review of how that works?
Well, there are a number of reviews, obviously, that have been taking place following the tragic events in Auckland a few weeks ago, including police, including corrections, including a variety of other different investigations. Not all of those have yet been completed. But in terms of electronic mail, I do think electronic monitoring, I do think it is something that we need to monitor carefully. It has expanded. The use of electronic monitoring has expanded. The previous national government actually indicated that they wanted to see the use of electronic monitoring expand, and it has. That means that I think we should continue to keep it under review. We should continue to make sure that public safety is not being compromised by that, and I'll continue to do that.
So is it your view that it's expanded too far?
Like I said, I think we need to keep that under review. I think in terms of violent offenders, I think that's something that we do need to look closely at, and I certainly will do that.
And on that report, obviously it was an internal report, not for external publication, but were you concerned, or are you worried by the concerns that were raised in that report?
As I've indicated, I think there's been a significant expansion of electronic monitoring, which there has been, and where concerns are raised about that, any responsible government would take those concerns seriously and make sure that they're looked at thoroughly, and we would absolutely do that.
Do you think there's a firm...
What is the likely last day at the podium for you in this parliamentary term? Has the last 8 months been everything you wanted it to be and more?
Every day is different in this job, and certainly what I set out to do in the 8 months leading up to the election has been disrupted a few times along the way. Some of those events have been within the control of our team, and some of them have not been, certainly weather events and so on. I got sworn in as Prime Minister on the 25th of January, and we had the flooding on the 27th. So there wasn't a lot of time to kind of adjust to the role. We just had to get straight into doing it. It's been an enormous privilege. I'd really like to continue to do that. I would really like to have a full term standing here at the podium and leading the country, and I'll certainly be campaigning vigorously to do that.
Prime Minister, are you thinking that some of this might be the last time of this and the last time of that?
No, of course not.
Yes.
Prime Minister, another matter. Can I ask, what regrets do you have, if any, pushing so much legislation through under urgency at the last minute?
All of the legislation is well signalled. So it is wrapping up legislation that has been working its way through the Parliament for some time. So if you look at things like resource management reform, water infrastructure reform, these are not exactly things that we're dropping into the Parliament at the last minute. This is legislation that's been working its way through quite a significant and considered process.
But there was urgency on things like the water reforms, isn't there?
Yeah, largely that's to get additional parliamentary sitting hours so that we can get that through.
Do you think this increases the risk of electoral flip-flop, which is something that the public quite often complain about?
In what respect?
Well, you pass it one day and then the next government passes it, repeals it, which is what Nationalists said they will do. So if it were done in a more considered way over 6 years, there might be less of that.
That is a risk with democracy, that sometimes new governments change the policies of previous governments. That's one of the reasons why I'll be campaigning for a stable government and the continuation of this one.
Are you going to be campaigning on any changes to fees-free tertiary education selection?
I'm not setting out our tertiary education policies today.
Students expect a policy around fees-free?
As I said, I'm not setting that out today.
To Joe's point, have
Yeah.
you not, in even a quiet moment today, considered that this might be your last time standing up at the podium?
As I've indicated to you all the way along, I don't have a plan B. I'm very much focused on plan A.
Prime Minister.
You
Rebecca.
said quite a different tone from you in your speech. Has kindness gone on the policy bonfire?
I think that the speech that I set out yesterday was a principled one. I've set out who we could and couldn't work with based on their values and the policies that they're putting before the electorate. I don't think there's anything personal about that. I think that that's principled, actually, and I think it's open and transparent.
Prime Minister, just on...
Over here.
I'm sorry, just to follow up. Just back to the Posey Parker question. When someone as divisive as that comes to New Zealand, what do you see your role as being, especially in a campaign period?
I think it's important that New Zealand maintains free speech, and that does include hearing from people who we strongly disagree with and whose views we may find abhorrent. I think it's important that we create an environment where people can strongly contest that and can strongly disagree with that and can be respected in the process of doing that. And that is certainly my goal as Prime Minister.
Is Immigration New Zealand looking at her visa status again on the way in? Is she being considered as an excluded person again? Are they doing that assessment?
I would not expect so.
Acknowledging that you've only been responsible for the past 8 months of the government, are you satisfied with the pace of the hate speech reform? The review was initiated on March 15, 2019. We're going to hit the 5-year anniversary with no legislation in Parliament. We're probably going to hit the 6 and 7-year anniversary with no legislation in Parliament. Is that fast enough for you?
I think in issues around hate speech, where different rights come into conflict, I think it's important that the Parliament proceed with caution. It was very clear that that was going to become a very hot and contentious issue in which the people that the law change was designed to support could actually find themselves on the receiving end of some pretty intense debate. And I didn't think that that was necessarily going to be good for those communities. So I think just stepping back a little bit and taking some more time is the responsible thing to do. Would I like to progress faster? Of course, but I'm not going to progress fast if that means alienating a whole lot of people and making other people subject to a whole lot of abuse which they don't deserve.
Just on the Warriors, just a slight change of subject. Would you support giving them a parade if they won the grand final?
Yes.
Well, let's just wait and see.
And so if you can settle a debate for us, what should be the official support line for the Warriors? Is it up the wires or is it let's go on Warriors?
I'm quite comfortable with either.
Which one do you prefer? Surely you must have a preference.
Well, it's a bit of a controversial topic. You're asking me to pick sides here. I'd probably go with up the wires.
Right, and so Mr. Luxon said today he's firmly in the up the wires camp. Yeah. So if they make the grand final, would you be open to participating in a video, you two side by side saying up the wires?
Why not?
Very good.
Thanks very much, everybody.
My feminine stage is bringing something to the budget.
I can go.
Stolen Greg O'Connor's look. You good?
Yeah, I'm happy.
Today, Grant Robertson has reached peak labour. After 6 years of spending New Zealanders' money with reckless abandon, he's now finally admitted he has a problem 6 weeks out from an election. This is far too little, far too late. It's simply not credible. And in order to sort the books out and get New Zealand's economy back on track, New Zealanders need to party vote National, now more than ever.
6 weeks out from an election, Labour is making changes to their fiscal plan. 6 weeks out from an election, National doesn't have a fiscal plan. Are you really in a place to criticise when you haven't set up any sort of alternative?
National has a fiscal plan and it involves more disciplined spending than we've seen by this government, driving better results for the New Zealanders' money that we spend, stopping wasteful spending and ensuring that New Zealanders can keep more of what they earn. To deal with your suspense, let me be clear, this week we will be releasing our tax plan. That tax plan is fully funded, which is to say it will not require a dollar of borrowing or extra spending. Instead, it will be funded through a careful program of spending reprioritisation and targeted additional revenue measures so that working people who have been crushed by Labour's cost of living crisis can keep more of what they earn.
The changes that Grant Robertson's made to your budget allowances, is that going to affect your tax plan?
That will not affect our tax plan. Our tax plan is fully self-funding.
When you say it's fully self-funded, is that just the income tax bracket adjustments?
Our tax plan includes a number of steps to reduce the income tax that the squeezed middle of working New Zealanders are paying and to reduce cost pressures that Labour has added to the economy with additional taxes.
Will you adopt these new operating allowances?
We will be much more prudent spenders of New Zealanders' money than Labour has been. You can guarantee that.
But they've just changed the operating allowances. Can you give us, I suppose you have to take it to caucus or something, but can you give us an indication that you're likely to?
Look, we've been saying for months that the government's spraying of the money hose has been adding to inflation and driving the cost of living. So it would be entirely consistent with that point of view for us to tamper down future spending. Yeah, I think New Zealanders should cut out the middleman. If it's careful spending that you want, just vote National. We've been telling Grant literally for years that he's addicted to spending and that if he doesn't stop, he'll land the country in trouble. Well, today is the day of reckoning. The spending has gone on for too long. There has been too much waste. You know, we only just recently learned that $45,000 was spent on a farewell party for a public servant. Clearly, discipline has not been in place, and this is just too little, too late. Look, my focus is on the New Zealanders who have been let down by this careless economic management. If Labour had listened to National when we said, look, pull up, be a bit more careful, the economy's in trouble, then we wouldn't be in this mess now. You know, Labour have sprayed that money hose around, and today Grant Robertson wants you to give him credit for saying he's going to clean up a corner of his mess. It's not good enough. It's too little, too late. To restore careful economic management, New Zealanders need to party vote National.
Do you have more leaks than more information?
Look, the public service have shared with me that they think that the government has been very lax in its management of taxpayers' money. They have shared with me that they think that there is a lot of waste across the system and that it would start with ministers being clear about what they actually want to achieve, something that has been sorely lacking from the Labour cabinet.
The whole of the public service has said this to you?
There are people in the public service who have said that to me.
So can you commit to running operating allowances at this level or lower? That's what I'm asking.
Yes, National is always more careful with taxpayers' money because we believe that New Zealanders can spend their money better than Labour can.
I guess given today's sort of announcement, you're probably going to have to go up and adjust your own fiscal plan spreadsheet to make sure it all fits within these new parameters.
How ready are you to do that?
We've always said that we would wait for the government to open its books at the pre-election update before we announced our final fiscal plan, and that's for exactly this reason. When Labor's in charge, they leave things in a mess. I remember in 2008 when Michael Cullen opened the books and left the key English government with a decade of deficits forecast. We're playing that out all over again. Labor spend too much money, economy in a mess, and National has to come in and tidy it up.
Some of these $4 billion of savings comes from ending things like the COVID-19 contingency fund and some money that could be given to DHBs. Did the government take too long to bring that money back in?
Yes, this is just more signs of their lax fiscal management. Here we are, and we're still talking about money being spent on COVID. You know, the analogy I'd give you is it's like the teenager who doesn't go to any lectures and then 2 days before the exam says, oh, I'm going to study really hard now. It's too little, it's too late.
Can you be specific on when the tax plan's taking you?
This week. I realise you want to know. It's going to be this week, and as I say, our tax plan is the responsible thing to do right now because New Zealanders are being crushed by the cost of living crisis. We are particularly concerned about the squeezed middle who have been pushed into higher tax brackets, are paying more tax, paying more for their rent, for their mortgage, for their groceries, and yet this government is taxing them more. Well, we're going to tax them less.
This week or this weekend?
This week.
Will your plan return New Zealand to surplus sooner and pay down debt faster?
As I've said, I need to see the pre-election fiscal update. Who knows how bad Grant Robertson is leaving things. He's driven the economy into recession, now one of the worst performing economies in our region. Inflation has remained high. Interest rates have risen quicker than in the history of the official cash rate, and now he's left a bloodbath in the books as well.
Yes, confirmed the surplus in 336 though. So you confirmed the surplus in the forecast period, so can you commit to that?
I want to look very carefully at the full set of government books that he is required by law to open up to New Zealanders prior to the election.
Do you think there's no conference yesterday, Labour also, Hipkins also announced his value set and setting out for women and out for gays and out for trans people and like vulnerable minorities. As National's leading moderate voice, are you a party scaring Conservatives?
Of course not. Look, it's pretty obvious what Chris Hipkins is trying to do. Change the subject. He wants to talk about anything except the terrible state of the New Zealand economy, which is punishing working people, making it very hard for people to get ahead. He knows that if people focus on the economy this election and the cost of living, then they will vote for National. So he's trying to distract them from that. And my message is actually New Zealanders aren't foolish. They know that in these challenging economic times, careful economic management is required, and that's what a national government will deliver. We've been really consistently focused on the need for better economic management to rebuild our economy, get it out of recession, get inflation under control, drive interest rates lower, and all of our policies have been put together with that goal in mind.
Do you think there are voters out there that want more than that?
Look, I think there's a lot of New Zealanders who also want a boost to their back pocket pay, and National will deliver it, and that's what you'll see from our tax plan later this week. I think New Zealanders also expect effective frontline services. That's why National has confirmed we will increase funding for health and education every year we're in office. But here's the thing, Joe, it's not enough to just spend more money as Labor has. You actually have to get better results from that, and that's why things like our plans to do the basics brilliantly in our schools by requiring an hour of reading, writing and maths each day are very important. It's not just about the dollars, it's what you get from them too.
What I'm asking though is it wrong to just write off things like women's rights, gays' rights,
under his prime ministership. So Chris Hipkins is trying to create a debate where one doesn't exist, and I think that's a pretty low form of politics, because let's focus on the very real debates in front of us. You know, the choice between a Labour to Party Māori Greens coalition that would increase taxes and put the economy at risk, or a national government that will reduce taxes for working people. These are the real choices at this election.
Labour's made it pretty clear that they're going to use that comment from Chris Luxon when he first became leader. He's obviously used Roe v Wade and referred to Simon O'Connor. Is National going to get to the point where you actually throw back and say, look, there's a whole bunch of people in the Labour caucus who also voted against abortion rights? I mean, why are you not playing that card back again?
Well, that's true. There are Labour MPs who voted against legalising abortion, just as there are national MPs who also voted that way. We've been consistent. We don't want to be drawn into culture wars that the Labour Party is confecting, when what the country requires from us right now is a laser focus on rebuilding our economy, dealing with the cost of living crisis, building incomes, solving crime, fixing up our schools, fixing up our hospitals. So we want to spend more time talking about those issues and less time talking about issues that are confected. Well, I think that they are misleading attacks, because Chris Luxon has been abundantly clear that under his prime ministership there will be no change to New Zealand's abortion laws. I've made it clear that it's a bottom line issue for me, and I share that view with many members of our caucus. Well, I think the way that we will fight back is by appealing to New Zealanders' consciences, which is that they want to see politicians focused on the real issues and not distracted by confected debate.
You've regularly criticised the government's spending on consultants and contractors. This announcement today at least gives a target reduction of 11% of public service expenditure. What National's target?
Well, we've made clear that we would want to reduce contractor and consultancy spending by at least $400 million. I'd note that to date, Labour has said, oh no, that's impossible, you couldn't possibly do that. And now they've had yet another road to Damascus experience. The truth is, across government, too much money is being wasted on consultancy reports that sit on ministers' desks unread, and National is going to bring constraint to that area of government spending.
So if a target of 11% for Labour,
we will be guaranteeing income tax reduction for New Zealanders. You've just had from Grant Robertson an admission that for the past 6 years he has been wasting too much money. He has managed to find literally billions of dollars after previously claiming there was none to spare. This beggars belief. It's simply not credible.
you'll have to change the funding of it because of today's announcement, won't you?
You will see our tax plan, and I'm very confident that it is fully funded. We have itemised the reprioritisations that need to occur to fund it, as well as the targeted revenue measures.
If you have bits in your tax plan that aren't going to take effect now but will take effect in the future, will those parts be fully funded as well?
I can see that you're asking lots of questions about our tax plan, and I'm glad that you're looking forward to it. But yes, the full tax plan over the forecast period will be fully funded.
What do you make of the Hitler project in Mr. Luxon's business? Concerns about what
I haven't seen the video yet, but look, it's all part of New Zealand's democracy. There are hecklers, there are people with interesting views, and I understand Chris Luxon dealt with it well, and I'm sure that there'll be more hecklers over the next 7 weeks.
Are the reversal of those property taxes still in your immediate tax plan in the next 4 years?
Our tax plan includes a restoration of interest deductibility for rental properties and bringing the Bright Line test back to 2 years.
Within the first term?
Within the first term?
Yes.
Usually governments run a deficit during the good times, spend more during the bad times. Do you worry that New Zealand has gone out of step there? And how will you handle that if we're in a recession, you're wanting to cut spending? How will you navigate that cyclical spending?
Yes, Labor has done what it always does, which is spent with reckless abandon during the good times. Even while unemployment was very low, they were in a very stimulatory position. That has added to our inflation problem, it has added to the cost of living crisis, it has added to debt, and it has been out of cycle. National will restore responsible economic management. I want to give you two numbers that I think are really important. Back in 2019, government's core debt was around 5.4 billion. Today, it is 73 billion. And the question New Zealanders need to ask themselves is, what do we have to show for all that debt? Our hospitals are in crisis, educational achievement is declining, crime is on the rise. Despite spending tens of billions of dollars, Labor has not delivered results for working people.
What debt level would you target as a percentage?
You'll see that in our fiscal plan.
You 1% to 2% cuts to the baseline funding for those different agencies. Would you like to see it go further than that, or like pick different ones where they could go further than that?
We will set out in our tax plan our approach for reducing backroom bureaucracy and reprioritising savings towards tax reduction and frontline services.
Would you allow commercial property owners to deduct?
I can see we're going to play a game over here where we're going to ask all the questions about my tax plan today, and with all respect, Janae, you can ask me that question later this week. Later this week. Later this week.
What does today's announcement mean for teachers and nurses and those who've been asking for better pay over recent months and were met with a line from government that there wasn't enough or wasn't any more money to add to their causes, and suddenly we find savings today? What does it say to them?
It says to them that Labor will say one thing and do another. You can no longer trust the words that come out of these ministers' mouths, because just weeks ago, Grant Robertson was pleading that the cupboard was bare and he couldn't possibly fund tax reduction, he couldn't possibly find further savings. And yet here we are, and he's completely changed his tune. He did the same thing on the wealth tax. He asked for multiple reports because he thought it was a good idea, and then Chris Hipkins had to haul him in the line. He did the same on GST. He said that reducing GST on fruit and vegetables would mostly benefit supermarkets. Now he says it's the best plan for tax reduction. He is stretching his credibility beyond belief, and I think New Zealanders will see through this latest episode.
Will your tax plan include only tax cuts or will it be tax increases?
Our tax plan is heavily targeted towards the squeezed middle of working New Zealanders who are working really hard, often juggling multiple jobs and family responsibilities, and yet they just can't get ahead because they're being pummeled by price increases and higher tax. Our tax plan is focused on delivering for them. Our tax plan will lower tax for working people.
And property investors.
And for landlords in order to reduce the pressure on rents, which are affecting working people. It's our tax plan is very focused on the squeezed middle.
Where are these additional revenue measures to be found?
You will set that out in our tax plan later this week. I can see that anticipation is high, and what I can also say is that we'll be providing an updated tax calculator so that all New Zealanders can see what's in our plan for them.
Can it tax people who are not working New Zealanders, but...
We will not be increasing income tax for working New Zealanders. That is not on our agenda.
Can I ask just how you chose the timing around releasing the plan? It's quite late in the campaign you're releasing this. What factors went into deciding when you would release it and when you would finalise your fiscal plan? And why is it late to release it?
We wanted to ensure that New Zealanders had time to examine our tax plan and understand what it delivered for them and their household. At the same time, we wanted to make sure that it was final, credible, fully funded, that it had been externally peer reviewed, and it is all of those things.
Thank you.